Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 best cards from the Whispers of the Old Gods expansion. Now, you might be asking yourself, why do I care about the Old Gods expansion? Well, there are a couple reasons. First and foremost, these cards aren't going away anytime soon for more than a year. They will still be a part of standard format, so finding good cards and identifying them and putting them into decks is still going to be relevant for a long while to come. Plus, it's just fun to look back through old expansions and see some of the best cards and relive the cards that have defined the meta, and many Old Gods cards are still doing so to this day. Not to mention, I'm a bit of a completionist, and I haven't done a top 10 list for Old Gods yet, so it's time to make that right. Now, before I jump into the list, I do want to make a couple small clarifications. A lot of the cards you'll see on this list aren't exactly dominant in the meta right now, but have still had a big influence as a part of the Old God set. Plus, I think they could still be very relevant moving forward into future metas. So they still make the cut on this list, even though they're not cards you might see on the ladder today at the time of this video's publication. I should also note that Old Gods has a ton of good cards, and narrowing down to a top 10 list was incredibly difficult. So don't be too upset if your favorite card isn't on this list. That's not me saying it's a bad card or didn't deserve to be played. I just had to do a lot of work to narrow this down to my personal top 10. Doesn't mean your cards are bad. There's a good chance I missed a ton of great cards, and I know for a fact I did. So don't be too upset. This, again, is just my personal opinion and the cards I think the average player is going to get the most value out of having in their collection and including in their decks. With all that said, let's finally jump into the list. Starting off with my number 10 card, it's one that doesn't look all that strong or all that exciting. It is the Warlock Minion Possessed Villager. Now, this guy might have a small body, a low cost, but that doesn't mean he isn't an influential card. In fact, he has been a staple in Zoo Warlock decks basically since his release, and he fits that archetype so darn well. I don't see Possessed Villager going away anytime soon. He's not going to win you games on his own. There's nothing incredibly special or exciting about this card. He's just fundamentally strong and fits an archetype in Zoo Warlock that has been around forever. So since that fit is so good, Possessed Villager has become a fundamental part of the meta, believe it or not. Moving on to my number 9 card, it's another one that fits its class unbelievably well. That is the 3-mana rogue spell, Shadow Strike. This just works in the kinds of decks that Rogue wants to play. They love high-tempo removal-type cards, and that's exactly what Shadow Strike is. Killing a 5-health minion for 3 mana is usually a huge advantage. Not to mention that when you combine this with things like Preparation and you get a 0-mana 5-damage clear, that is absolutely absurd. Not to mention it's also a spell, so it synergizes with all the other spell synergies that Rogues love to utilize. Now for my number 8 card, this is one of those cards that I mentioned that probably isn't all that popular in the meta right now, but it's just fundamentally good and powerful and has been an important part of all the Cthun decks that defined the meta at the beginning of the Old Gods expansion, and I suspect will linger around. This, of course, is Twin Emperor Voeckler, and it's just the ultimate 7-mana stat play. You lay down this card, as long as your Cthun is buffed sufficiently, and you suddenly get 8-12 in stats, but not to mention is it just an 8-12, it's also taunted. So it's so difficult for your opponents to deal with. It shuts out aggressive decks almost completely as long as you can make it to turn 7, and gives you the survivability and the control you need to last until you can finally play that Cthun that traditionally will win you the game. Speaking of Cthun, he's actually also the number 7 card on my list. Of course, this is one of the Old Gods that inspired the name for this expansion. This card was forced to be reckoned with early in the Old Gods meta, where Cthun decks were just running rampant across the ladder. Now, that certainly isn't the case still today, but there are a handful of Cthun decks that still pop up from time to time, namely Cthun Warrior, that is still a strong variant on sort of the Control Warrior archetype. So Cthun and his horde of minions haven't gone away, and he's a powerful card that has a really cool effect. He does a completely unique thing the Hearthstone has never seen, and I don't know that there will be future Cthun synergy cards coming out, but even if there aren't, there might be other cards that sort of enable or set up the really powerful late-game Cthun style of play, and because of that, I think Cthun deserves to not only be on this list, but perhaps might actually see even more play in the future, just depending upon how the meta moves and shifts. And that's why he's one of the top 10 cards still to this day for me from Old Gods. Moving on to my number 6 spot, it's actually another Old God. This time, though, it is Nezhat, another card which spawned an entirely new archetype of deck, clearly fitting within the control style of play, but Nezhat decks are ones which utilize a ton of Death Rattle minions for a huge game-winning turn on the back of Nezhat and his Battlecry. Nezhat decks have always been powerful since this card arrived. They're still good, and anytime new Death Rattle cards come out, they could continue to get even better. So Nezhat has already been a fundamental part of the meta, has the potential to do even crazier things, and as long as this card is in standard format, I think it's going to be good, and it's going to potentially see play, even if it doesn't necessarily fit into a top-tier deck. Nezhat is a fundamentally solid and strong card. Now, it might seem a little silly to go from 2 Old Gods themselves to a 1-mana spell, but that's exactly how good Bloodseeker is. This card is just an incredibly powerful early game tempo play for Warrior and different kinds of Warrior decks that like to get onto the board relatively quickly. It also combines very naturally with a lot of the things Warrior likes to do, which is enraging its own minions, but also activating execute plays on enemy minions. So this is a card that is very simple in its design, but also incredibly elegant in how well it fits its class, much like some of the other cards we've already seen on this list so far, making it a staple in anything but the most late-game control Warrior decks, and even sometimes in those as well. So it doesn't look like much, but Bloodseeker is incredibly strong for its class and has seen a ton of play since its release, making it a very important part of the Old God set. But for my number 4 spot, we're moving back to the big shiny legendaries with Fandral Staghelm, the Druid class legendary. This guy is just so cool and nuts and fun. I actually think he has one of the game's best effects because it takes something that has been so central to the class with choose one type cards and breathes an entirely new life into them in a very powerful and scary way. And frankly, Fandral Staghelm has basically been in every Druid deck ever since his release. And he's opened up a ton of new avenues for Druid in an important way because the class was nerfed pretty significantly, and Fandral gave them a new chance at life, and there are a lot of powerful Druid decks to this day thanks to cards like Fandral and all the different really powerful plays that he opens up. And now it's time for the top 3, and some of you might be surprised that Flame Wreath Faceless actually only made it to the number 3 spot, because this card has been one of the most discussed and most disgusting cards in the Old God set. Of course, it is the Shaman minion Flame Wreath Faceless, more commonly known as the 4-mana 7/7, because nobody really cares about the name. This card has been incredibly oppressive in the meta. Shaman has been dominant for a very, very, very long time, in part thanks to this card. So it's no surprise to see it here. It has been a huge influence ever since its release, and it doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon, just because a 7/7 body on turn 3 or turn 4 is absolutely ridiculous and so hard to deal with, and makes Shaman a true force to be reckoned with. Now, you might be surprised that this isn't actually number 1. That's an easy debate and an easy argument to make because it is so strong, but I actually think there are 2 cards that are even better than Flame Wreath Faceless, believe it or not. The first of which is the Warrior minion Ravaging Ghul. As good as Flame Wreath is, Ravaging Ghul I think is even better. It's another one of those class cards that fits so darn well into what its class is trying to achieve. Of course, its Battlecry does 1 damage to all other minions, and normally it would be bad to do 1 damage to your own minions, but Warrior actually loves that kind of stuff a lot of the time. It opens up so many different avenues of play, whether it's enraging minions or hitting Acolyte of Pain to draw cards. There's countless ways Warrior can benefit from that, and often they don't really care either if it's just on a neutral minion. But also, of course, doing 1 damage to enemy minions is a really powerful play, especially in a meta where there have been a ton of token minions with 1 health out there. So Ravaging Ghul It's usually a very powerful tempo play that helps you clean up the board. It activates executes. It activates your own minions in positive ways. It has a solid 3/3 body for its cost. This is just like the perfectly designed minion. It's incredibly overpowered, surprisingly, even though it's so simple in its design. And it fits into Warrior absolutely perfectly. And I think every Warrior deck since this card was released has included 2 copies of this, and just indicating how incredibly powerful it is. And of course, Warrior has also been a very powerful class in this meta as well. So Ravaging Ghul, fantastic card. It's not going away anytime soon. And it's the ultimate Warrior minion, even though it's only a 3-cost card. This may or may not surprise you. I actually think Thing from Below takes the top spot. Now, a lot of people would say Flame Wreath Faceless belongs here and maybe move Thing from Below back to the 3 spot. But honestly, Flame Wreath Faceless is seeing a little bit less play nowadays. It's being pulled back as Shaman gets even more aggressive. It is a card that can be punishing in regards to its mana cost with the 2 overload. Whereas Thing from Below is a card that isn't being pulled out of Shaman decks. It's still always there. It's an incredibly high tempo play because it usually costs 0 mana when it's played. And as oppressive as a 4 mana 7/7 is, it's not nearly as bad as a 0 mana 5/5. Even when this card gets played for 2 or 3 mana, it's still incredibly good because it's a 5/5 body that also has Taunt, which makes it so very annoying to deal with, and because it protects so many other high-value things that Shaman already has access to, like those really cheap Tunnel Trogs and who knows what else, right? So it has been in basically every Shaman deck there is, and Shaman, of course, has dominated the meta since Old Gods release, making this, to me, actually better and more important and more impactful than Flame Wreath Faceless ever was. I think this card is even more powerful and more oppressive and deserves absolutely the top spot on this list. To me, Thing from Below is actually the best card in Whispers of the Old Gods. And that's going to do it for my list. Now, undoubtedly, there will be people out there who disagree with me. I would encourage you to share your thoughts and disagreements in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take on the 10 best cards in the Old Gods expansion. What takes the #1 spot for you? What cards did I miss? Share that discussion. I'd love to read it and engage with you. But until then, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.
Hey, buddy, watch this.